Good deal. All right. Welcome everybody. If you are looking for the breakout of the carbon effect, property valuations across regions and acres, you're in the right place. I'll do a quick little intro here, and then Brooks and I are both going to share some perspectives, and we'll launch into discussion and then questions. But just to kind of set it up, so carbon markets aren't exactly a new thing. They've sort of been a long time coming and developing for really the last decade. But here, this last year and a half, there's been really kind of a dramatic increase in the demand for forest carbon credits, and that's been matched here recently with an uptick in investment interest. And we see that seemingly in the news every week or so. Some new investment fund or vehicle looking to work with both timber and carbon. And that sparks a lot of questions that both Brooks and I get. And so we were asked to talk a little bit about the development of that market, how that's shaping up, and share some perspectives on how and why that may drive value increases across the asset class differentially. So not the same for every acre, not the same for every region. And we'll just discuss some common questions that come up as we've been working with landowners and with buyers on a lot of the stuff with investors, and then open it up, like I said, to audience questions. And so with that, we have Brooks queued up to kind of share first, and we'll go from there. You got it, Brooks.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks for including me on the panel. Zach's controlling my slides. I've got 4 slides, including the one you're looking at, but I'm going to walk through 3 slides. I'm going to give a quick update on the research that we're doing at Forisk, then talk about a big level, a couple forest carbon things, and then do a couple micro forest carbon things, and then hand it back to Zack, and then we'll discuss a couple topics. But if you could carry us 1 slide forward.
I believe I can. There we go.
Super. A quick update on our business. We have I can see folks who are on the call, a lot of subscribers, clients are on the call, and we really appreciate your research. I'm going to highlight 2 things for you. We've got our researchers here in Athens and an office out in Washington, but every quarter we produce the Forisk Research Quarterly, and we always have a big research theme in addition to the forecast. In Q4, it's our supply quarter. So we're running supply models for every state in the South and in the West, and those feed into our projections for the industry and timber prices. And they influence the work that we do related to forest carbon, because the supply models, they generate the volume that we can translate into carbon storage and sequestration. And so that's an important part of the research. And the other thing I'll highlight is our timber market analysis workshop, which we had to cancel last year because of COVID, is back up. It'll be online this year in December, half a day spread out over 2 days. We walk through our market analysis process, and we would welcome having you join us for that. And one of the things we will be talking about is forest carbon as well. So, Zach, let's go to the next slide. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So at a high level, Zach mentioned and Zach and I have a chance to compare notes because we get a lot of the same questions, but he and I sit in different seats. So we're coming at it from different positions. I'm sort of outside of the sector, looking at it as an analyst. Zach's one of the leaders in the sector, and so when we get to compare notes, we do get to hear that there's a lot of common questions. And we also have some common ways of thinking about a few things. But this is the framework that I've been using in talking to clients, but also investors or reporters, because there is a strategic aspect of forest carbon. And it does, if I'm in a strategic planning session or a capital allocation process, forest carbon actually fits really well in that discussion because the markets have evolved a little bit. So 5 years ago, this was a much harder conversation to have. But now when you put all the attributes of a timberland investment up on the board, or even when you're thinking about it from the supply chain side of a wood user, forest carbon is its own distinct market and product, in essence. Forest carbon is a product. It's a forest product in our sector, just as we would have described wood bioenergy as a forest product. And the attractiveness of forest carbon is uneven, right? It depends where you are and where you sit. And so a 2x2 matrix like this just highlights 2 of the key attributes that you're trying to match your forest carbon contracts or opportunities on, is where you have a lot of alternative uses for your forest and wood markets versus how much forest or timber supply you have out there. And forest carbon just pops up as super attractive when it stands on its own without a lot of competition from traditional forest industry users. And so it is a constant allocation process of, when you look at where a lot of the forest carbon growth has been, it has been in parts of the country where you have thinner or shallower traditional forest industry markets. That said, you see now cases, even with the kind of stuff that NCX is doing, that there are some complementary plays even in more traditional markets. And so we're watching how that thing evolves. But it's this allocation over space and time. It's got to pay for itself relative to what's already on the ground. We can start to allocate our time and effort into different parts of the country. And Zack, if you don't mind, we'll go to the last slide. So from a very, very applied, just mathy, quantitative forest finance point, every year I teach a forest finance workshop. And now for the last 2 years, we've been talking about forest carbon and how to do the math. And the math is easy. So it's a very discrete, specific piece of present value math about what the true opportunity cost is for one given owner in one given local market. The math varies by local market. It varies by how productive your forest is and by your discount rate. And from that, we can estimate an opportunity cost. When you think about the different forest carbon contracts, the old ones that started with 100 years and down to 40 years, and now the 1-year deferral contract, basically this rental, that 1-year piece of math is very straightforward, and the opportunity cost is very clear, especially because it's a small time horizon. All the inputs are sort of known and the variables are less. We have less uncertainty with it. I think part of what's interesting for me, because this connects to the previous slide, is, are you even relevant and interested? And if you are, then you go ahead and you do this math. That's the order. That's the order of operations. What's interesting about the deferral contract in this case is that it tackles a small slice of the forest any given year, right? So it's a small, easy commitment to make. And if you get enough of the slice across the forest, it scales and you get some progress moving forward. But over time, if something like this were to take, you'd essentially expect to see things like the average age of the harvest go up by a year, right? It's little, but also you don't have to allocate capital to all the other parts of the forest that aren't even in play. They're essentially not relevant in the short timeframes we're dealing with. So in terms of the efficiency of allocation of capital and forest carbon, these shorter durations, they have less uncertainty, so less risk. There's more that's knowable, and it's a pretty efficient use of capital. So then the issue is there's a bunch of technical issues that Zack will probably address, but they relate to the same questions that we get all the time is, well, at the end of the day, how do they affect valuations? How do you address leakage and permanence and persistence and additionality? Are we really changing behavior? And these are the traditional questions that come up a lot. Zack, I'm going to hand it back to you. So thank you for that.
Yeah, awesome. And I will switch over slides here, see if that'll actually work. All right. Okay, so are we there? Success, rare in this world. All right. So yeah, thanks. Brooks gave a really great primer there on kind of how at least we're seeing thinking come together around pricing of these things and how that may factor into valuations as we're looking at different pieces of property, different spots. So I'm Zack Parisa. I'm the CEO of NCX, the Natural Capital Exchange, and really what we do is use sort of an AI-powered base map data set to reduce transaction costs for landowners to enter into carbon markets and originate these credits that can then be sold to these sort of net zero companies that we were talking about. Kind of they're ramping up demand for this stuff, at least in voluntary markets. So really simply, that just means that we work with a lot of the both kind of TIMO and REIT folks, many of which I see on this call. Hello. We're helping them enter these markets and get paid for additional carbon that they can grow on their properties. And then at the same time, we're working with these buyers and hearing a lot about their preferences and sort of where that's going. And since the structure of our market is a reverse auction, and meaning people can name prices that they would need to receive on different properties to choose to grow more carbon rather than send send wood to a mill. We have this perspective on how those prices are being differentiated and how they're sort of playing out in the market. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that here. There we go. But we're also, since we don't have loads of time here, we're going to keep it really simple and just focus on fundamentals about what sort of how this actually is coming together. The bottom line with this, just as Brooks mentioned and showed in his graph there, is that the primary value drivers are and what actually underpins what this product is that's being sold, this forest sort of quasi new forest product, is that you're changing management. So you're augmenting the harvest plan that you have, and that has embedded costs, which we're accustomed to seeing in either a harvest schedule or sort of in the discounted cash flows that we put together. And that's like when you hear terms like additionality, that's really what's being talked about there, is that change in management. And that has to be true if real value is being created and sort of transmitted through these markets to these buyers. And the second piece that comes up is kind of this over time aspect. And what Brooks showed there is like a 1 year deferral, which is what NCX is working on, or working with. But there are also these contracts that are 10 years, 40 years, 100 years. And so those amount to selling options on management going forward. And there are different implications for those that factor into how they get priced and how that kind of, again, transfers through to appraisal values and the like. But in the end, this is what's being contemplated on each of these acres. And when you put all of this together, one of the sort of different things about these markets is that there's no transportation cost. There are costs of transaction, although those are being driven down through measurement technology improvements. But while since there isn't the loss of value to transportation to the mill, basically we're seeing the same thing that Brooks mentioned, that where right now at prices that are being paid for carbon, places that have thinner, shallower markets for timber that are more distant from mills, where value is lost to transportation, particularly, that's where the greatest percentage gains are being realized from engagement in the carbon market. And then this is like many of the important graphs that a lot of us are looking at, and certainly a lot of the investors that are coming to the forest sector that are very new to the forest sector, not really used to the timber side, but are very interested and engaged on the carbon side. They're looking at price accretion in carbon credits over a period of time. I just grabbed this Bloomberg forecast from, I think, April this last year, so it's a little bit dated, but and this is for the European market, but it's indicative of what's going on in both the voluntary and other markets. And the view here is that demand is going up and to the right, and so prices are likely to go up and to the right. Supply is constrained. And so like the question right now for acres, when you start looking at this is, does it pencil out? So is it worth engaging in the carbon market? Is it break even? Or is it that, this is a new market, and by exposing acres to this new market, there's sort of a jump in value for those different properties? And as we go forward in time, are you engaging in contracts that allow you to realize this value accretion or expected value accretion over time? And that kind of gets into the set of questions that we'll kind of roll through in discussion here. And I just grabbed top three that Brooks and I chatted a little bit about that we think are particularly interesting. So now we're just going to kind of bat it around a little bit. And Brooks, I'll ask you the top one here. So you see people put appraisals together, discounted cash flows together all the time, and help advise on that. How are you advising folks to deal with carbon? How are you seeing people deal with carbon given the uncertainty and in sort of future prices and contracts?
The challenge with the big challenge is with long-term duration contracts. So this one is not settled law. This one is, I talk to multiple appraisers every quarter about what's going on and how they're doing things in different parts of the country. And I'm hearing almost as many stories as I am having phone calls. And part of it is that we haven't been in these markets long enough. We haven't had enough deals sell that have carbon contracts tied to them. So in cases people are advocating for them as augmenting or enhancing value, and some people view them as lean, so they actually detract from value. For some of the long-term carbon contracts, you can actually get negative MPVs from the point of where you are in time, because a lot of the cash flows were paid early in the contract, and you can be at a position where the balance of the contract is not favorable to a new owner. I've seen examples of that penciled out. In terms of the shorter term duration contracts, I don't see a lot of effect right now. Part of it is because people are ride it out and they know what the terms are, so they feel like there's less uncertainty. I will note one thing about discount rates related to these things. The longer the contract, the higher the discount rates, that people are trying to factor these things out. So they are concerned about that. For shorter term contracts, I haven't seen big adjustments in the discount rate. In fact, I've seen examples with the 1 years, and I haven't seen people modify the discount rate at all, because it's baked in with all known inputs.
No, that makes sense. And that's one of the reasons that the 1 year contract got put forward, was to reduce forward-looking risk and increase participation to address kind of near-term supply. And one of the points that you made sort of about uncertainties reflected on the buyer side as well. So Microsoft just put out, they published an article in Nature, or a sort of an editorial article in Nature here recently, documenting their experience buying in, forest carbon credits, and in kind of their attempt at articulating what it is exactly that they're buying and how that's going to go forward. And it's uncertainty for them in those definitions. It's that's sort of that's making it difficult, I think, for both them and others to clarify what contract terms are going to work best going forward. And that's, I don't know, so it's that piece on the demand side that I think winds up kind of across the dots, moved over to the supply side, where where it's just a challenge putting these things together. When we work with folks that are engaged in the market here, it's easy enough with 1 year term contracts, because you know what the payment is going to be, and there's not an encumbrance thereafter that has the potential to be reduced in value, or sort of have no sort of continued return thereafter. So
I'll mention one other thing about valuation, since it's related to this, is so in the stuff I get to see, it's, if this is the floor, if this is timberland values, and even regardless of the length of the contract, I see forest carbon markets they're more pulling up from below than they are adding to the top, right? They're bringing up these, and it's sort of, you mentioned the shallower, thinner markets in your comments. And so they're taking these forests that are out here, and they're bringing them up to the floor with everybody else. And we're not yet at the level of maturity, depth, or history yet, where all this could happen on top of the existing timberland investments. But I don't have a lot of examples of that, of sort of properties in established timber markets that are getting enhanced value from forest carbon. I see it all in guys that are catching up to the middle, which on the average would bring everybody up, right? It brings
average valuation up, but just like you say, it tends to be more of the kind of marginal acreage, where there's still exposure to a timber market, and therefore there's still additional carbon to be created. There's still change that can happen in the harvest schedule that translates to real value for people like Microsoft. Additional carbon, but it's, at prices being paid, there's enough of that. There's enough supply in those forest types. Just like you say, it's kind of filling up and increasing the average value, but it isn't yet sort of the most productive, sort of in the hottest market. It's not affecting those acres as meaningfully. And that's,
The other thing it does is we're always tracking the investable universe. And it appears to be on the margin that potential exists for expanding the investable universe, because you're doing it this way, but you're also reaching out to acres. So the old marginal acres are now in the market, and you have new marginal acres now that are their neighbors. And so that expansion of the footprint is quite interesting. And so that's a positive forestry story as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that reflected in some conversations we're having. So drivers of differentiation. And this is, there are a couple of ways of talking about this. It's a little bit of a nebulous question, but differentiation in terms of credit quality that winds up getting sold. Different programs produce different, they're asking different things for different periods of time. And so there's different realized values for buyers, but then also differentiation just in terms of, again, acreage and regions that that are actually engaged in these programs.
So, Zack, you and I probably think about this one a lot differently because the question from this one comes a lot differently. Not necessarily contrasting, just different, right?
Yeah.
So the two things I'll highlight on this one is it gets back to that sort of the strategy framework of where the contracts are relevant geographically, spatially. So it's back to the story, the parts of the country where we have the shallow or thinner markets where this thing is like, it's story A or story B if I'm talking to someone in the timberland space. And if we're in a really deep market in the South or the Northwest, it's story C, D, or E, depending on how good and how deep the market is. So it differentiates that way. I think for me now, what's happening is it's getting more differentiated across owner types.
Yeah.
There's just certain investor types that they've been looking at this there's people on the call now that have been checking this out or looking at it or talking to folks or have direct experience 10, 20 years. I mean, these have been around. The concept's been around for a while. The contracts have been around. They just haven't been as deep as they are, or as diverse. And it's now I'm talking to smaller folks or family offices or people that hadn't really thought about this stuff before, or maybe their investment objectives are a little bit different than an institutional investor, a US-based institutional investor, or a European-based institutional investor who has ESG as their A or B story. It's different for them as well. One thing I bring up is, on the forest finance side, if I know something about the philosophy that an entity has about allocating capital, and in 5 or 10 minutes, we can quickly figure out if that entity is going to be competitive on a given timberland deal, because I know how they do the math, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now we've injected an ESG factor, and that ESG factor actually makes it harder to assess what people are actually willing to pay for timberland properties over time. And you can see that even in the Wall Street Journal story that came out yesterday about new investors, right? So that new JV, when you see stuff like that happen, it actually makes you think differently about the timberland investment model, because some people are coming to the table with a totally different thesis. And that thesis has to be accounted for by anybody who wants to be competitive.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And from, I'll start on here with like drivers on the buy side. One of the things that I'm not going to say we were surprised to see, but I was interested to see the depth of interest on is association of forest carbon credits with buy side supply chains.
Yeah.
So real interest in locality. So if you're emitting carbon in Georgia, then you would perhaps prefer to purchase from landowners in Georgia, even if that's a hot market and has a higher carbon price per ton. So that runs counter to kind of that, that shallow, thinner markets potentially in some areas, and similarly like in Oregon, Washington, that kind of thing. Strong interest there, despite the potential that in those sort of hotter markets, those are going to be higher cost tons of carbon, because it simply costs more to defer harvest there in some cases. So there's that piece. And then the interesting thing is another interesting piece is attachment of value to other forest benefits like wildlife, biodiversity type things. And so hardwood forests that are in areas or have other environmental attributes that are of interest to buyers tend to be interesting. And I think has been reflected, that same interest is reflected in some of these ESG investors, just like you were speaking about. They're looking at this further out and they're like, yes, there's a carbon market now. Yes, there's a timber market. That's all well and good. There are also going to be markets for these other for these other attributes. And, so while that's not fully formed, they see that value. And so they're investing with that in mind, or at least putting together thesis statements with that in mind. So that's been fascinating to see. And then this final one, and we're kind of rolling in here too. And we talked about this a little bit, but
yeah,
contract time lengths, 140, 10, 1. Any final thoughts on that?
The only thing I'll say is, like, and it's obvious to everybody else, but since we're always trying to look forward in markets and timber markets, the shorter the time frame, the easier it is to do the math. And so from that standpoint, for 40 and 100-year stuff, we're not even attempting to, we don't, there's so much we still don't know about how it's going to play out for a timberland investor when they transact. The 10s, they're just easier to talk about and do the math on, but that's not an excuse to do them or not to do them. It's where we are analytically.
Yeah. And that's why the 1-year contract really got put together. And I think why there's interest on both the demand and the supply side. There's sort of an ease there of assessment of risk and it's more straightforward. And also, given price forecasts, generally being up and to the right for the value of carbon, locking in, selling a 10-year contract at today's prices might not look so hot in even a year or two.
And I do have a thesis on the contract length with respect to the global carbon market. And I know, Zach, you and I have talked about this, but it's a little bit like the way we thought about pellet markets going to Europe. It was designed to be a stopgap, a bridge between the next thing. And I think forest carbon has some similar attributes. Although forest carbon could be around and last forever, in the global carbon market, forest carbon markets is small, relatively speaking, and it likely could be a shrinking share as that market expands. And so the shorter contracts just let you play with more rigor, because this is going to change. So in 5 years, the whole setup's going to look different. And so I do think about that.
Yeah, I've heard much the same from folks that we're working with. So we're pretty close to time. I took a quick scan through the chats, and I saw, Jim, what looks like maybe the beginning of a question, but I'm not, couldn't quite get something out of that. If anybody has any closing questions, otherwise, Brooks, any other things you wanted to touch on here?
Zach, I'd love to hear what are you excited about, and also major, like, what's at the top of your list on technical challenges you're addressing? Because I'm getting a lot of technical questions too. So
So technical questions. So when articulating value to the supply side, there's the question of additionality, there's the question of leakage, and there's the question of permanence.
Yep.
And those elements have been they've been in play for a long time, but we're really kind of coming to ground on what that means and ways of attaching that to measurements that have that are lower costs, so we can get these transactions sort of moving more quickly and in a more automated fashion, and with more certainty on both the demand and the supply and the demand side, buy and sell. So, from a technical standpoint, it's really the idea is to make it easier for buyers easier for sellers to understand exactly what the opportunity is for any given acre, which can tie into either investment or just straight management. So those are, it's the very, very quick rundown. It comes down to measurements. I mean, the thing that I keep going over with people is, like, timber markets are a little bit, it's like they're easy or they're made possible because we have a scale at the mill. It's a physical thing. Buyer knows they got what they paid for. Seller knows they got paid fairly because, everyone trusts what the scaler or the scale itself says at the mill. And up until now, we just haven't had that with some of these non-extractive markets, carbon being one of them. The value is delivered on site, and it's delivered to these buyers as a non-physical good. They're not taking physical delivery of this thing. So they have to trust that what they're getting is real. And that's, where that's compromised, that erodes trust, that erodes value, and value realization to a supplier that can sell a real product. And that's where a lot of the measurement stuff comes in. That's where the satellite imagery, ground measurements, all the technical back end. But the point is to make that easy for sellers of all sizes, so that they can just think critically about what decisions are going to make sense for them, what's going to accrue the greatest value as they define it. And that's what we've been really laser focused on here for the last many years.
I can tell when someone has talked to you or been on the website, because I'll talk to someone who didn't do anything with forest carbon markets before, but their first question is not a 101 question. It's a 201 or a 301 question. They're already asking about leakage and things like that, and they know what it means. And so a lot of shoe leather has been burnt, getting people sort of educated. So I can hear that from the questions.
Yeah. And so, just a quick plug there. So we have a white paper on our website, ncx.com, that does kind of go through that 101 piece. And yeah, if we can be helpful, please reach out. I know for Brooks, the reports that you've been putting out have actually been really helpful for us on our side as well, just kind of seeing that perspective. So thank you for that. All right. Well, with that, I think we're just at time, and really appreciate everybody joining the session. Reach out to Forisk, Brooks, or me at NCX if we can be helpful. And have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for including me, Zach. Thank you for everyone for joining us.